Welcome to this presentation of Interactive Story. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss a bit about the design philosophy behind Interactive Story and give a practical example of writing a text adventure using this philosophy. As an example, I'm going to reenact a rather infamous puzzle in the text adventure genre, and that is the one of acquiring the Babelfish in Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you've not played this particular text adventure and you want to give it a try, then stop here because there will be some spoilers ahead. Okay, so you're in the hold of a Vogon spaceship and you need a language translator to understand the Vogon language. The scene in question requires you to get a Babelfish, which can translate all other languages into your own, from a dispenser. Unfortunately, the process is not straightforward, as something happens to the fish on each step of the journey. I won't cover the full solution here. However, if you search on the term Babelfish walkthrough, you'll get some excellent sites that describe this puzzle in detail. Okay, so acquiring the Babelfish is relatively complex, with interaction required between several items and objects, and maintaining quite a few descriptive states. Since I don't want to plagiarize, I'm going to offer my own creative take on this puzzle. Okay, so let's get started. First, open the Interactive Story editor by entering interactivestory.com in the browser. This will bring up the home screen. From here, you can browse the library, change your preferences for the website, and of course write your own text adventure. I'll click on Write a Story and enter a new title called Hubbub Grub Tutorial. When starting a new story, the first thing Interactive Story will ask you is to enter a description of the opening scene. Now, I'm not going to make you watch me type an entire story, so to speed things up, I will be cutting and pasting text. Okay, so the opening scene gives a brief description of the Hubbub Grub, which is our version of the Babelfish. You're a stowaway in the hold of a bygone spaceship. There is an announcement coming from the public address system. The language is unfamiliar and sounds a bit like someone gargling spaghetti. Click on Submit and we get the main view into the editor. So we have the scene name, event description, and then a list of choices on what we can do next. In this case, add an action. There are also several other options that I'll explain later. We can click on the scene name if we wish to change it, and the same for the event name. Clicking on the event description will allow us to edit it. This quick edit approach is used throughout the Interactive Story editor. Any form of story description can be edited just by clicking on it. Okay, let's add our first action. Actions are the choices a reader can make in progressing our story. There are two types of actions that the reader can perform: explicit and implicit. We'll start with an explicit action. Explicit actions are displayed directly to the reader, and this is the choose-your-own-adventure approach to interactive fiction. The reader must select one of the actions in order to progress the story. Explicit actions can be descriptive and usually offer choice in the direction of the narrative. So, our first action will be listen to announcement. Click on Submit and we'll be asked to describe the outcome of this action. Snibble off Ganooberbrush, onk tinkle globberorky. Although you do not understand native Bygone, the tone of voice gives you a lingering sense of dread. Click on Submit and we'll then be asked, does this outcome take you to a different location? If we answer yes, then Interactive Story will ask us to set up a new scene. However, for this example, we will stay within the one scene, so I'll always say no to this question. Next, we will be asked to edit the current scene description. If an action results in the appearance of an object in a scene to change, then we may wish to alter the scene. Since we are just listening to the announcement, we will leave the description unchanged. Okay, we've just added our first action, and you'll notice that the editor now reflects what we have done. We have an outcome, the current scene description, a list of available actions, and a new action, plus an undo option. Why undo, I hear you ask? That's because the editor actually plays our story as we write it. If we click undo, we go back to just the description of the opening scene. If we click an action number, we then perform the action with a corresponding outcome and a possible update to the scene description. So let's undo again and test what we have. To play our story, click on the T Test This Scene button. We have the opening scene and our explicit action listed. Click on the action and we see the outcome. Click on the Stop Test button to return to the editor. Okay, the opening scene description says we're in the hold of a spaceship. So let's examine the hold. So let's go Add Action, and this time we will make it an implicit action. An implicit action consists of a verb applied to a scene object or inventory item, with an optional preposition applied to another object or item. For example, open door or open door with key. In this case, we will select Examine and enter a new object called Hold. So now we have Examine Hold. So let's describe the outcome. As you examine the hold, you notice it is mostly empty. However, in one corner there stands a rather unusual looking dispensing machine. Next to the dispenser is a black briefcase. Again, we select No. However, we will change the scene description to You're in the hold of a bygone spaceship. There is an unusual dispensing machine in the corner. Okay, we have our outcome and scene description, but you will notice we have lost our list of actions. Why? Well, this is because we have created a new event in this scene. When we change the scene description, Interactive Story will automatically create a new event. In this case, Examine Hold. So, why do we not see our previous actions? Well, it all comes down to the Interactive Story philosophy of breaking the narrative up into a sequence of events within a scene. When we change the scene description, we are basically saying we are at a new stage in the narrative, and hence all previous actions may no longer apply to this new event. As we will see, this allows us to break up a complex narrative into a series of smaller and more manageable steps. Okay, let's undo and see how this works. We now have two options to progress the story: the explicit Listen to Announcement and the implicit Examine Hold. When we click on the Do It button, notice how the display is updated. We now have a new scene description, and the story ends because there is nothing left to do. Let's add a new action. Examine the briefcase that's next to the dispenser. Examine, New Object, Briefcase. Outcome: it is a shiny black briefcase with a spring lock mechanism. And now, let's add another action. Examine, add a new object, dispensing machine. The dispenser is painted a high gloss fluorescent green. On the front panel is a picture of what looks like spaghetti, with an arrow pointing to a dark brown slug. Another arrow points from the slug to an image of a perfect sine wave. Under the picture are the words hubbub grub. There is a large brown button on the front of the machine. No. And a new scene description. You're in the hold of a bygone spaceship. There is a bright green dispensing machine in the corner. Next to the dispenser is a black briefcase. Okay, so now we have another event. Let's add use, new object, brown button. And the outcome is the dispenser begins to hum and vibrate. The hum slowly begins to rise in pitch until it almost sounds like a squeal. Suddenly, a brown blob shoots out of the top of the dispenser, passes over your head, and lands smack into a small hole in the opposite wall, disappearing from sight. No, and in this case we're going to keep the same scene description, hence we will remain in the current event. Okay, we now know about the hole in the wall, so let's examine it. Add action, examine, new object, hole in wall. The hole is just big enough to swallow the hubbub grub. The fact that the projectile path of the grub exactly matches the spatial coordinates of the hole provides positive proof that your existence is preordained. You take a deep breath and resolve to accept what lies ahead. There is a hook just above the hole. No. Again, we will remain in the current event. Let's test by going back to the first scene. Note that Interactive Story does support a lot of keyboard shortcuts. You can usually use the first letter of any button. So typing U, for instance, is the same as clicking the undo button. Likewise, A for add and T for test. You can also use S for submit and C for cancel. And you can do this for just about any other button you encounter. Okay, the first thing you'll notice is that the dispensing machine and brown button do not show up in the implicit options. This is because we have not yet encountered the events in which these objects are used. Because we've moved to the next event, we now have the option to examine the dispensing machine and the briefcase, but we can't use the brown button. Again, we move to a new event, and the objects for that event are now available to us. Okay, at this point you may notice we can actually examine the hole before we have used the brown button, which isn't quite right. Normally we would break this up into two events, but as this is a complex puzzle, we're going to use another feature of Interactive Story, and that is conditional actions. So let's edit the Examine Hole action and click on the Advanced button. This reveals several powerful options. Requires allows us to set up additional conditions for when this action becomes available to the reader. Add Item adds the selected items to the reader's inventory when the action is performed. Remove item does the opposite. Go to Scene and Event allows this action to direct the reader to a different part of the narrative. For actions that don't change the scene description, this will be the same scene and event in which the action is defined. And we have several other options which I'll explain in a moment. For now, we're interested in the Requires option. Here we can build up a logical statement on when this action will become available to the reader. In this case, when we have used the brown button on the dispenser. As you can see, we can start with several premises. Have, not have, meaning we have or not have a given item in our inventory, and done, not done, meaning we have done or not done an action in our story. Since we only want to examine the whole after we've pushed the brown button, then our logic is, when done, use brown button. Now, you will notice that Interactive Story lists all the currently defined actions in this scene. So it is a simple matter of selecting the required action. Once selected, you can click on the link to verify it is the action you want. Okay, so let's test to see how it works. We'll undo twice and test. So we only have brown button available in the noun list. Let's use it. Up comes the outcome of the grub going into the hole. And now we can examine the hole. You may have noticed in the advanced settings the option Do Action Once Only. When checked, Interactive Story will automatically remove the action from the reader once it has been played. However, some actions, particularly if they don't change the scene description or advance to a new event, can be safely played multiple times. Let's do the same for Examine Whole also. So let's test this. Okay, so we just have brown button, so let's use, and now we have hole in wall. Let's examine. And as you can see, brown button is still available. So to recap, the Interactive Story editor breaks your narrative up into individual events within a scene, with each event having its own set of actions. The editor automatically creates a new event when the outcome of an action changes the scene description. Okay, so let's take a look at how we can use this event action grouping to progress our story. Our main plot or puzzle sequence is as follows. Examine Hold and Examine Dispenser. These two events we've already done. The next event is to hang a bathrobe on the hook to cover the hole. Then we need to cover the drain that is below the bathrobe, and in this case we're going to use a tea towel. Then we need to stop the cleaning robot by covering the opening to its exit. And finally, based on how we've manipulated the items in the narrative, we need to go to one of several final outcomes, each being its own event. Okay, so we need to add a bathrobe to the hook. Add action. Use new object. bathrobe with new object hook. The outcome will be you remove your bathrobe and hang it on the hook. And we will update the scene description. You're in the hold of a bygone spaceship. There is a dispensing machine in the corner with a black briefcase next to it. A bathrobe is hanging on the wall opposite. And we don't want to perform this action until the reader has examined the whole. Requires, when done, examine hole in wall. Before we go any further, you're probably wondering, where did this bathrobe come from? We haven't mentioned this object in the narrative so far, so this would be confusing to the reader. Let's go back to the first event. Now, we could make the bathrobe an item in the user's inventory. However, for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to take a different approach. I want the reader to be really aware of the fact that we're wearing a bathrobe, and to try and keep a sense of vulnerability about the situation they are in. So what we can do is use a scene variant. This is an optional addition to the scene description that is based upon a logical condition. To do this, we click on the scene description and then select Show Variants. You'll notice that we are presented with the familiar logic constructor. So let's select When Not Done, use bathrobe with hook, then Add to Event or Scene. In this case, we want to display it for multiple events, so we'll add it to the entire scene. The following description. You are wearing a toasty white bathrobe. So now, when we test, we will see this addition to the scene. Examine hold, and examine dispenser. Notice our scene variant is for the entire scene, so it will show up in each event. Use brown button, examine hole, use bathrobe with hook. And now, because of the condition we set, our scene variant is no longer displayed. We can display a scene variant for just one event or across multiple events. And we can also do the same for actions. So let's add a new action, Examine Bathrobe. The outcome is, it's a very warm bathrobe. Although it seems a bit odd to be wearing such a garment at this point in time, you seem to be comfortable with this fact. Undo action. Okay, so to make this action available across multiple events, we need to check action is valid for rest of scene. Now this means the action will be available to the reader not just in this event, but in all other events as well. In this case, we also want to add an extra requirement. Since we remove the bathrobe later on, this outcome will not make sense. We need to add requires, when not done, use bathrobe with hook. Because we can use this action in any event, we should also change where this action takes us in the narrative. In this case, we always want to stay on the current event, as examining the robe has no impact on the narrative progression. To do this, change the Go to Event option to be the default event, which, in interactive story speak, means the current event in which the action is executed. Finally, we will uncheck the Once Only option, since there is no reason why we cannot examine the bathrobe as often as we want. Okay, let's test this action. Examine bathrobe. And there's the description. Examine hold. Examine bathrobe. Still works. Examine dispenser. Use button. Examine hole. And examine bathrobe, and we still get the description. Now you've probably noticed that there is more than one way to stop a test. If you use the Stop Test button, you will return to the last event you were editing. However, if you select the Edit Scene button, you will return to the editor in the current test scene. Not only that, but you also have the full history from the playthrough when testing. Which brings us to the topic of bookmarks. At any time, you can use the H key to examine your edit history. As you can see, the full undo and redo history is shown in the drop-down list. So if we select the first entry, we will go back to the first event. Likewise, we can jump back to where we were through the redo history. Note that if you perform any action in the editor, the current redo history will be lost. To add a bookmark, go back into History, select where you want to be, and click on the Bookmark button, or press B. You will then be prompted for a bookmark name. And that's it. The bookmark, along with its full undo history, will appear in the drop-down list. The bookmark actually plays the actions listed, so not only will it get you to the required scene event for editing, but it can be used to quickly test the sequence of actions for the expected outcome. In other words, if you change the behavior of any actions that the bookmark traverses, then this will be reflected in the final scene and event that the bookmark points to. Okay, so let's use the bathrobe with the hook and continue with the next section. Use brown button. The dispenser begins to squeal and a grub shoots out of the top of the dispenser, passes over your head and lands smack into the bathrobe. The grub slides down the bathrobe and disappears into a small drain. Again, we will remain in the same event. We now know about the drain, so let's examine it. A permanently attached grill with grub-sized holes covers an opening to the spaceship drainage system. Since we're remaining in the same event, we only want to do this after pressing the brown button. Requires, when done, use brown button. And we'll allow this action to be repeated. Now, to stop the grub from going down the drain, we will add, use, new item. Now, this is the first time we are introducing an item into the story. Tea towel. And unlike objects, which are associated with a single scene or event, items, once placed into the reader's inventory, will move with the reader from scene to scene and event to event. This means any action defined in an event that uses the item will only become active when the item is in the reader's inventory. Since we can examine an item at any location, we need to give it its own description. In this case, a slightly tea-stained tea towel with a picture of a pub next to a bypass on it. Notice at this point, since the action only deals with an item, we can allow this action to be performed at any scene or event. However, we want to use this item with the object drain, so performing at any location no longer makes sense. Outcome: you carefully unfold the tea towel and place it over the drain, thus catching the object that should fall from the bathrobe. And now we change the scene description and move to the next event. You're in the hold of a bygone spaceship with a dispenser and a briefcase. A bathrobe is hanging on the wall opposite. Below the bathrobe is a tea towel. Let's undo and make sure we can only do this when we have examined the drain. Requires, when done, examine drain. And we only want to do this action once. At this point, you're probably wondering, where do we get the tea towel? Well, I'm glad you asked. Throughout this scene, we want to introduce a subplot as follows. We open the briefcase that is sitting beside the dispenser. This will give us two items, a tea towel and a new deck of cards sealed in plastic. We then want to close the briefcase, open the sealed pack of cards, and place the cards on top of the briefcase. We also want this subplot to be played in parallel with the main scene. So to do this, we need to go back to the first event in which the briefcase is introduced. Let's start with examining the briefcase. We want the action to be valid for the rest of the scene, and allow it to be done multiple times. We also want to stay at the event in which we perform the action. Now, let's add opening the briefcase. You release the catch, and the lid springs open with some force. You are somewhat startled as a pack of cards and a tea towel fly out onto the floor. You pick up the items. OK, so we need to add the items to the reader's inventory. Click on the action description and select Adds Item. Select Tea Towel and submit. We also need to add the deck of cards. An ordinary deck of cards, ideal for a game of 52 pickup. And we want to do this only once. OK, so let's test this. If we click on Inventory, we can see it is empty. Now let's open the briefcase. Now we have the items in our inventory. Okay, so let's play this through in the editor. Now, let's test opening the briefcase. As you can see, we can't use the tea towel with the drain because we don't have it in the inventory. But we can examine the briefcase and open it. And now we can use the tea towel with the drain. As you can see, the combination of inventory items and actions, grouped by events, creates an intuitive flow for the reader, with the interactive story engine automatically keeping track of the available commands. We've done a fair bit of the story, so we probably want to save what we have done so far. To save the story, select More Options, Save this story. Enter a description and select the genre. We can save to local web storage or publish privately or publicly to the interactive story library. You can also export as a text file in XML format. If published to the library, then you can download your story for further editing on another device. Just browse the library in the My Published Stories and click on the Retrieve button. Interactive Story does have an autosave feature, so if you do close your web browser without saving, the story will be made available to you the next time you use the editor. I hope you've enjoyed this introductory tutorial on Interactive Story. You can play the final version of the Hubbub Grub via the link in the video description. Don't forget to visit the Interactive Story forum for more information on the editor, and feel free to ask questions or make suggestions. Thank you for watching.